Kundalini, in its most primordial essence, is not a biological force, nor is it a mystical ornament exclusive to Eastern doctrines. It is a symbol, a living metaphor of the psyche's potential to transform itself. Represented in ancient imagery as a serpent coiled at the base of the spine, it echoes the universal motif of the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail, signifying the cycle of death and rebirth, of beginning and end coexisting in one eternal present. In dreams, visions, and myths across cultures, the serpent has always been an agent of change, a guardian of the threshold, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, a harbinger of both danger and enlightenment. Likewise, Kundalini sleeps within the unconscious as a latent possibility, not imposed by external teachings but archetypally embedded in the human condition itself. It is the root of individuation, the inner compulsion to become what one truly is beneath the masks of persona and the conditioning of culture. This serpent force remains dormant until the psyche is ready to confront its own depths. Its awakening is not an achievement but a summons, a call from the deeper self demanding that consciousness expand beyond the ego. It is the first stirring of the self asserting its primacy, initiating the painful but necessary unraveling of illusions. Just as the alchemist stirs the prima materia to begin the work of transmutation, the awakening of Kundalini is the beginning of a process that seeks to unify the fragmented self, to move from multiplicity toward wholeness. Kundalini, then, is not a force to be mastered, but a reality to be encountered. It is the symbolic key that unlocks the hidden chambers of the psyche where old gods sleep, where forgotten desires burn like embers, and where the soul waits patiently for its own birth. What we call a spiritual orgasm is not merely a heightened sensual experience. It is the symbolic eruption of eruption. Psychic wholeness. In the language of the inner world, orgasm is not confined to the body. It is the release of repressed energies, the reconciliation of opposites long divided by the mind's dualism. It is the sacred marriage, the hieros gomos, between the masculine and feminine principles within the psyche, the animus and the anima, the solar and the lunar, the fire and the water. In this moment, time collapses, identity dissolves, and the soul, for a fleeting instant, remembers its origin beyond polarity. The experience is often described in terms of bliss or ecstasy, but these are only symbols attempting to clothe the naked reality of psychic fusion. Such moments come not as rewards for spiritual discipline alone, but as consequences of alignment. When the conscious ego becomes permeable to the deeper layers of the unconscious, when resistance gives way to union. Spiritual orgasm is the symbolic breaking of boundaries. It transcends gender, body, and thought. It is not an act, but a psychic event. The inner flood of energy is not localized. It surges through the entire being, electrifying forgotten aspects of the self. It activates archetypes long buried in shadow, bringing them not only to awareness, but into relationship. Here lies the mystery of transformation. What was once fragmented begins to pulse in rhythm with an inner cosmos. At its deepest level, the spiritual orgasm is a rehearsal for wholeness. It is the soul's brief remembrance of its divine architecture, its original symmetry before division. The ego, for once, is overwhelmed by something greater, not in annihilation, but in awe. In that encounter, the individual does not disappear, but becomes more than individual, a vessel, a channel, a field through which the sacred polarity of creation moves, reconciled and alive. The energy awakened through Kundalini is not different in kind from the psychic force that animates our dreams, impulses, visions, and creations. It is the libido, not in its narrow sexual interpretation, but in its fuller symbolic form as the raw life force of the psyche. This energy is the breath of myth, the fire of imagination, the invisible hand shaping civilizations and inner landscapes alike. It is the same force that builds temples and utopias, that writes sacred texts and conjures nightmares, that binds atoms and births gods. In most individuals, this energy remains entangled in unconscious patterns, dissipated in repetition, neurosis, or culturally sanctioned distractions. But when Kundalini begins to rise, whether through deliberate inner work or as a spontaneous psychic event, the libido is redirected inward into the vast subterranean architecture of the self. No longer exhausted in outward projection, it begins to reveal its original function: creation. Not as imitation, but as revelation. This is not creation in the literal sense of manufacturing objects, but in the metaphysical sense, the shaping of inner reality. The awakened libido rearranges the psychic constellation of the individual. Old complexes collapse or mutate, archetypes take on new vitality, and the mythic dimension of life begins to shine through the mundane. In such moments, one does not merely believe in symbols, one lives within them. The psyche becomes a cosmological space, a microcosm in dialogue with the macrocosm, in dialogue with the macrocosm. The energy that creates worlds is not external. It emerges from the deepest layers of the soul, from the primordial void in which all form begins. When Kundalini stirs this energy, one is no longer living as a fragment isolated in time, but as a participant in the great unfolding, an agent through whom the universe becomes conscious of itself. The awakening of Kundalini does not begin with light. It begins in darkness. Before the serpent rises, it coils inward, downward, into the forgotten chambers of the psyche. This descent is not a regression, but a necessary return to what has been buried, denied, or rejected. The individual must confront the shadow, the personal unconscious filled with wounds, contradictions, and unintegrated desires, as well as the deeper collective strata where archaic forces dwell. One does not ascend by denial of these layers, but by conscious descent into them. Every myth of transformation begins with a journey into the underworld, whether it is Inanna's descent, Orpheus's sorrowful search, or the biblical Jonah swallowed by the great fish. These are not tales of failure, but initiations. To awaken Kundalini without first touching the underworld is to build a temple on sand. The true ascent is built on the foundation of what has been redeemed below. The unconscious is not chaos, but an ordered reality that speaks in symbols and effects. It holds both poison and medicine. The monsters that dwell there are often fragments of the self waiting to be named and welcomed. The descent into this realm is terrifying because it strips the ego of its illusions. It shows us that we are not who we thought we were, and that the forces moving within us are older and more mysterious than our waking mind can comprehend. Yet it is precisely through this descent that the conditions for ascent are created. The energy of Kundalini does not rise through repression or bypassing, it rises through integration. Each confrontation with the unconscious loosens the grip of inner conflict, unblocks the psychic channels, and clears the ground for transformation. As the lower energies are acknowledged and reconciled, they begin to transmute. What was once rage becomes courage, what was once fear becomes wisdom, what was once shame becomes compassion. The ascent into the divine is not a flight from the human, but a deepening into it. The divine does not exist apart from the unconscious, but is born from it, as the lotus rises from the mud, or as the phoenix is reborn from ash. The serpent climbs the spine only after it has tasted the root. The higher chakras do not open through ambition, but through surrender, through the courageous act of turning inward and facing what lives in silence behind the eyes. The nature of Kundalini defies final explanation, for it belongs not to the realm of knowledge, but to the realm of experience. It is a mystery in the truest sense, not something to be decoded, but something to be entered. The mind, trained to dissect and categorize, cannot contain it. Every attempt to define Kundalini too precisely risks turning a living symbol into a dead concept. The serpent moves, transforms, eludes capture. It is always more than what the intellect can grasp. To live this mystery is to walk a path marked by paradox. The journey is at once personal and universal, chaotic and ordered, destructive and creative. One cannot trace it with a map, because it unfolds uniquely within each individual psyche. The signs are not linear but synchronistic, meaning emerges through dreams, intuitions, symbols, and sudden shifts in inner landscape. These are not accidents, they are communications from the deeper layers of the self, calling consciousness to pay attention. The ego may crave mastery over this force, seeking to command or accelerate it, but such efforts are always inverted. The more one tries to control the mystery, the more it withdraws. The serpent does not rise at will. It stirs when the conditions are right, when the soul is ready to hold more truth than the personality is comfortable with. The activation of this force often comes disguised through loss, through rupture, through silence, through inexplicable joy or terror that cannot be traced to outer events. In this way, Kundalini becomes a living dialogue between the conscious and unconscious realms. It teaches not through instruction, but through encounter. The world itself becomes reflective, mirroring the inner process through symbolic events, patterns, and relationships that seem orchestrated by something beyond ordinary causality. These are not mere coincidences. They are footprints of the mystery moving through time, reshaping perception, unbinding old narratives. The mystery of Kundalini does not offer answers in the traditional sense. It does not resolve the contradictions of life. Instead, it deepens them, renders them luminous. It invites the individual to live inside the question, rather than rushing toward conclusions. The mystery becomes a teacher, not by explaining, but by transforming, the way fire transforms wood to ash, or how love transforms solitude into communion. Through it, one does not escape the human condition, but becomes radically intimate with it.